Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. We are going to do some coding on our Debug UI today. We've got a lot of it working, and we did the integration with the game yesterday in terms of like unifying the UI between the two systems. And so now what I'd like to do today is just kind of like go in there and sort of play around with getting it all, straightened out to the point where we can kind of navigate the debug info the way that we might want to. And it kind of looked like yesterday, just looking at it, for a debug UI, it kind of felt like we might want to also pass some modifier keys into the game. For debug purposes, such as like whether the Control, Alt, or Shift keys were down, that seemed like something that we might want to do. Again, not really for any kind of gameplay purposes, but actually just as part of the debug packet. So like when we pass it, for example, the mouse location and the mouse buttons, which are only really used for debug, those would also include some modifier key information. So that's what I'm going to do today. It's day 213 on Handmade Hero, so if you pre-order the game on handmadehero.org and you're trying to follow along with the source code at home, you will want to take day 212 source code and you'll want to unpack it into a directory so that you can match up with what I'm doing and do the changes yourself or play around with the changes yourself. So here we are at where we left things the other day. We did sort of have this concept of being able to like hover over entities. We still haven't really figured out how we want to do sort of the hit detection when there's multiple entities. Like there's the space entity that kind of encompasses each individual room, and depending on the random order in which the entities get traversed, sometimes that'll get picked. So for example, I can't pick a tree down here because it picks the space entity first, whereas I can, for example, pick one of these trees and so on. So at some point we probably have to address how we want to do picking in order to make it more useful. We might just not allow space entities to be picked for now, or something like that, so that you can only you can pick the kind of entities that are a little more obvious, like these ones, which we can't pick right now. That's something we should probably address. But then also what we kind of want to do is sort of have a little more coherent idea of what's going on over here. What I did yesterday was make it so that I could kind of like highlight a bunch of these guys, and you can kind of see them displaying here. But there's a number of things that don't really quite work in this scenario. Some of the interactions sort of work where I can look at some of these things, but it's not really entirely stable, and we don't have things like the collapsible menus and all that stuff, and we also don't have our old debug things. So again, there's just a bunch of code in the debug system now that we figured out, and it's going to be kind of this process of integrating it all together and making sure that it's all nice and stable and clean, usable, friendly, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and keep going down that route. So the first thing that I'd like to do, again, is I think I'm just going to pass those modifier keys, because right now what happens is like I just keep selecting entities, and they keep getting added to the set of entities that are like selectable, right? And you can kind of see what's happening. Also, our frame rate is awful at the moment, because if you remember, one of the things that we also have to do is make it so our debug system only processes a frame at a time. We're not doing that currently either. So yeah, we just have a lot of stuff to do just in terms of like basically code cleanup. I think we have all of the pieces for the most part that we actually need, but it's just not all working in a nice smooth fashion because there's just too much jankiness in too many places. That's the nature of code when you go exploring to see how you want to build something. It's nothing to be concerned about unless you then don't actually go and clean it back up, in which case it's something to be very concerned about. But as long as we are going to go do that, no need for concern. So first I'm just going to fix that modifier key problem, because the modifier key situation is definitely a little bit busted. So I'm going to go ahead and make it so that we can do standard shift select and that sort of stuff. This again is going to be really straightforward. All we have to do is provide some way of sticking that information into the input system. Again, with mouse, it's just a sideband thing that comes in here, right? This is for debugging only, right? So you can kind of see, even we could stick it down here and just say, oh, hey, you know what, this is for debugging only. So if a platform layer, for example, didn't want to implement mouse input, or the platform doesn't have a mouse, it can just leave those things empty, and it's fine. It just means you can't access the debug services with the mouse. And presumably that's okay on those platforms. So what we want to do now is just have some things here where we have like shift down, alt down, control down, something like that. That would be a really simple way to just have those modifier keys get passed through the system. Again, this is not for gameplay. This is strictly for use in our debug system. So in the code where we have our mouse X, mouse Y, and mouse Z, all we really need to do to make sure that this stuff works relatively well is just kind of go in here and set these things to whatever the state was of those modifier keys at the time at which we pass through this code, and that will be plenty sufficient for our purposes. Nothing happens when you like tap the Control, Shift, or Alt keys, so we don't need to worry about counting like ups and downs or anything like that. We just need to know if they're up or down at any given time so that we know how to interpret a mouse button click that's on that frame. So if we want to figure out whether Shift, Alt, and Control are down, we can actually use the same sort of information that we had before. There's a thing called get key state and also a thing called get async key state. I'm not sure if we use any of these. Yeah, we do. So we can just come in here and use this exact same stuff that we have been doing, our get key state stuff. And the get key state will tell us whether something is down or not. And you can see that we already sort of have that in here. We were already doing this information right on the get key state. So we can literally just do the exact same thing here, where we just test to see if these keys are down at the time. And if they are down, we set it. If they aren't, they aren't. Now, the VK codes in Windows for these keys are exactly what you would expect. So we can literally just type them in. Oops, I think it's actually menu. So I take it back. I think it's not Alt. They called it menu for some reason. Don't ask me how I know that, and don't ask me how you were supposed to know that. I think probably what I would recommend doing if you don't know what the VK codes are, you could probably do, well, there's two ways you could probably get that. One is in Developer Studio. Remember I showed how to make, if you just use the project wizard to create a project, it'll create a project that has like browse info and stuff like this. You can do stuff like this where you just do, okay, I know one of the VK codes is, well, in fact, I just type VK and you can see them all here. The browser back button, okay, whatever it is, right? If I type one of those VK codes in, I can usually hit the right mouse button over it and say go to definition. And you can see that like we've got all of the VK codes that are not ASCII codes are actually listed in here, right? So you can actually see these VK codes just kind of laid out for you. And you could probably tell, like, even this comment tells you VKL, VKR, left and right Alt, Control, and Shift virtual keys. And you can see that it actually just says menu here, right? And again, with left and right control keys and left and right shift, left and right menu, they have their own unique versions for left and right, but there's also a version that just encompasses the key in general. So you can see, I don't know where it is up here, here it is. You can see that there's also one that just was either of those down. And I believe all it does is if either the left or right are down, it will set this one to down. And since we don't care about left or right Alt in this case, we're just going to use the unmodified ones. But if you cared about like which specific one you were talking about, in that circumstance, you would want to use the correct modifier. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that worked because it was so simple. Now maybe that's a foolish assumption in programming. Sometimes it's the simplest things that go wrong. It's true. But I'm just going to assume that worked. And I'm going to go to our add to selection function. And so in here you can see we had a to-do that was like, let's figure out a way to do multi-select. So now I've got that. And so what I'd like to do is be able to do something like say, okay, if the shift key is down, then I want I'm sorry, if it's not down, then I want to clear the selection. If it is down, then I want to go ahead and add the selection. Now, I don't know if we actually have that. We do in here. Okay, so just want to make sure that we had access to the input data. So now in theory, I should be able to, oops, that's not the project we want to run. In theory, I should be able to now do multi-select the way that you would normally see it in any normal application. If I click the mouse button, you can see that I've sort of like permanently selected that guy, and I can do that. And you can see that it clears the selection each time. But now if I hold down the shift key, right, you can see that I can kind of stack entities up there, and that's all well and good, right? And so that's fine. Nothing, again, particularly odd going there. I will say that one thing that looks pretty weird to me and that I feel like is kind of cause for concern. I'm not sure why there's such a dramatic speed decrease here when all I've done is just add more entities to that selected set. And I wonder if that's just because we don't have anything that's optimized for font rendering and the font rendering is slow, or exactly what's going on there. Because it looks like, like that frame rate is pretty slow, and then if I switch back, the frame rate jumps up quite a bit when I reduce the number of them there, right? it just looks a little bit odd. You can even see, like, look at how much that went up. Milliseconds wise is pretty dramatic. And so I will also wonder there if we've got a little bit of some bug stuff happening there. And so if nothing else, that kind of gives me motivation to finish the integration work here so that we can get our profiler nice and easy to use as well, so that we can investigate stuff like that and see like who is actually taking more time when we see that those times kind of jump up the way that they do, right? But anyway, that was it for adding the modifier keys, so that's pretty straightforward, nothing particularly unusual going on there. If you followed Handmade here since the beginning, that was a pretty trivial add. Okay, and so now what I'd like to do, again, is sort of try to start to consolidate these things a little bit. So we've got the ability to display this data, but now we kind of don't really have a coherent story for how this kind of data and data that's, say, for example, coming from different kinds of sources might interact with each other, right? It's because we have like stuff like the profile data, and we don't really have any sort of we really don't have any way of talking about how these different things interact with each other, or how they work for that matter, right? So what I'd like to do is again try to kind of make that start to make that link be a little bit more, and it's a difficult problem, and so I'm just going to try to push through it in a straightforward a way as possible. So if we look at what happened before, we used to kind of have this notion that we would build some stuff at the beginning, and in fact we had this kind of debug variable stuff here, and you can see that the debug variable stuff is basically all gone now, right? We've eliminated all this debug variable stuff. We'd still like to be able to have stuff like this where we set these debug variables, right? I mean, that's something that we would kind of want to do. And so we have a couple different ways that we might want to go about doing that, and we could sort of think about this in a little bit more direct fashion, right? So what we would like to do is we'd like to be able to have these, like, you know, before, when we were doing this, I had to write this code kind of out of line, right? So what we did is we went through, and in fact I can do this pretty simply. If I go to our debug config.h, right, we had this config file that was sort of written out by the debug system, and you can see in here all of the places that we actually had our debug system list, all of the UI things that we were going to do. So if I were to turn this off, if I were to say that we no longer get this, I would get, I would get essentially compile errors, presumably, or I thought that I would get compile errors, or maybe I won't get compile errors. Okay. I was assuming I would get compile errors where I saw these debug UI faux, like all of this stuff. I guess that's not actually true, because I guess they would be, I guess the way we were testing them, they would default to 0. I guess. I was surprised. I thought it actually might give me an error. But I suppose I could actually do something like this, presumably. No, I guess not. So what exactly is going on there? Why is that happening? I would like to know. I'm going to see exactly what we were doing. Maybe we just did if defined. Is that what we did? So you'd think that this would have caused some kind of a, yeah, it would, like, I don't know. Let's see what happens here. So is there literally no way that I can force this sort of a thing to be erroneous? Maybe faux v4 is not a thing. Let's try this. There we go. All right, so that one's just not used. Okay, good. So this is what I can do then, to sort of give me a thing that would tell me everywhere that I was using one of these systems, right? And so here we can sort of see, like, okay, here's, you know, one of the debug variables and so on. So if I look at this and I go, well, what would I really have wanted to do here optimally? You know, is there something that's better than what's going on here that I was going to do? Now, what we found when we did our testing was that having an if, as long as the if was constant, really didn't make a huge deal. And so it's sort of like it's free as long as it's a perfectly predicted branch to do this instead. Looked like that was fine, right? It didn't look like that really cost us very much in any predictable, in any real way. And so one of the things that we saw when we were doing our debug system was that having to wait for it to recompile the game was just too long. Even though it only took like a second or two, it's like just not fast enough for what you want to be able to click the button and just be able to switch, and it didn't feel good and it wasn't nice, right? So what I'd rather have in this system is something that looks like this. You know what I'm saying? That would be preferable to me. And the question here is just how exactly would I go about doing something like this in the most convenient way possible? Because before, what had to happen is we had to have all of this stuff in there, and this system and was sort of a separate thing, right? And we had this whole thing I had to write. There was just a lot of business involved, right? And yeah, the usage code, the code at the usage site, nice and simple. No complaints with that, really. It was totally fine. But all of this nonsense garbage that was happening out here, just a lot of extra work that I maybe didn't want. And so since it's clear to me that we don't really need to go the compilation route, we tested it. It doesn't seem like it's that necessary. What we could do instead here is just do something like having this dribble all over ourselves. That's always a good thing. Just do something like, okay, if I've got something that I want to test here, you could imagine something like this. I don't know, something like this, or like a debug switch, and then I just pass like what the debug switch is that I actually want, right? And then this would be some macro that expands to whatever is necessary to make this be a switchable thing that I can switch at runtime, and add it to whatever list actually it needs to be added to. Or I can actually sort of say what that list might be that I might want to add it to. So for example, in here, show letting samples was part of the renderer. So I could do something like saying that it was part of the renderer, like that. So I can have sort of a hierarchical sort of a thing going on there. I could even do something a little more stringy, and maybe do something that was like a path, or even like a dot sort of a thing, or a colon. Right, you can sort of imagine me constructing something here. And that would be a lot kind of more interesting, because if I had something that worked like that, then it would be self-assembling, which is a lot more like the way the rest of the debug system is going, right? The profiling stuff just kind of dumps to a buffer. It would be kind of great if this stuff just dumped to a buffer as well. You know what I'm saying? So I would like to see if that is something that's on the table. I don't really know realistically how on the table it actually is, but I think it might be possible to do. The only thing that I'm not certain about is the way that this if works, I think might be a little bit too much, right? In other words, this I think could probably work. This I think probably could not, right? So it would probably have to look something like that, which isn't really that big of a deal at the end of the day. But the reason that I say that it would probably have to look like something like that is because if you look at what will have to happen, oops, let's get interface there. If you look like what would have to happen in order for that to occur, we would need to do something where there would be a notion of some kind of a static variable or some kind of something happening there, where we would have the debug system be able to cache a lookup so that every time through the code, it would not have to do anything more than just the basic if, right? So in theory, you know, I guess what I'm saying is this can't really be, if we want this to be a lightweight function that just kind of does a test and continues, it needs to be something where the debug system can always access the variable very easily. So it needs to be something like, you know, it needs to be something where there's a static, right? It would need to be something like this. So there's a, you know, a debug if that's some name, and it would create some kind of a local, you know, a variable that was locally declared to be persistent. And I don't remember, I feel like we have, yeah, right here. So we have a way to do that. We'd say this is a locally persistent variable. It's like, you know, whatever the debug ID is of this thing or something, right? I don't know exactly what we would want that to be, but we declared some local persist debug ID for this thing, and then we would do like only on the initialization pass through the thing, we would do like get debug ID for, you know, parameter or something like this for, you know, I don't really know, and we'd pass the name. That would be something that on the first pass through, it would call that thing and do the initialization that's necessary, right? And then what we would do is we would switch on the value of that thing. And really this, I guess, wouldn't be a debug ID. It'd be more something like a debug you know, value. And we would just say like, okay, whatever this debug value is that we got back. In fact, I might almost say it would look more like this, where we would have like, I think you'd want to almost pass the address of the debug value. So we'd say like, okay, initialize debug value, something like that, where we just go like, okay, whatever the initial value of the thing is, it will return it here, but we'll also let it know the address of this thing, because I think the debug system would probably want that. I think it would be allowed to do that, because you can use the value inside the expression for the value. All right. So like we'd need to do something like this, right? Where if debug, you know, if we do a debug if, you know, Boolean or something like this, right? Where we could kind of switch on that sort of thing. And this, you know, honestly would probably be something like a debug variable. It'd be like, or a debug event, like we kind of have. Because since we already have this concept that you can have all of these different sorts of variables, if we take a look in here where we sort of have this debug event that has all these sort of sets in it, this would probably just be, honestly, a debug event. Yeah, that's what I would assume would happen there. And so really all we need to do is have some way of sort of making this be unique, right? We want to make sure that it's not going to be something that, we want to make sure that that value, if we were to use multiple of them in the same function, wouldn't name conflict. And debug value by itself will definitely name conflict. So, you know, we want to do something like this, where we would paste in to this some kind of a an extra value on there, right? Something that would give us sort of the additional, you know, uniqueness that we need, like the counter. But unfortunately, we can't really do it that way, because as we've seen many times, passing the counter value in doesn't work directly. So you need to do this absolute nonsense here, you know, that you've seen me do a couple times, where if we wanted to do like a debug if or something like that, we would have to be able to create that debug value using one of these things that you pass down multiple times. So I think it's something like this, where you do name, right, counter, and then in here you pass it one more time. And then, finally, you get to the actual one. Ladies and gentlemen, the C++ preprocessor, not good. Not good, right? Again, the C++ Standards Committee has had how many years to fix this stupid thing? But since Strustrup hated the preprocessor, it languished and never got made into something you could actually use. But don't worry, because they also didn't add any language features that would make any of these things work, so it's all worked out. Anyway, so if we do this stuff, we should be in good shape. If we wanted to make a thing where we could sort of replace our stuff with debug ifs that look this way. So I'm going to just see how that ends up being at the end of the day. Let's find out how it goes. Like I need to do that, obviously, and this needs to be that, I believe, but I think otherwise we're in good shape. And then just this guy right here still needs to be like that. And that should be good. One more time. And initialize debug value, not found, you know, that's correct. And you're also saying that there is an single pound sign that you don't recognize, possibly results in max. Okay, well, I'm not sure what the problem is there, but let's fix this part first. So this part right here, this would be some kind of an internal that returns a debug event. It's called initialize debug value, and what it's going to do is it's going to take you know, a debug event here that says this is the location of the thing we're trying to set, and here is the name. You know what I'm saying? So that's all good, and so now that should be defined. This, oh, so this is great. That's just complaining about future stuff. So now if we want to, like with this debug UI, use debug camera thing and that sort of stuff, now we can replace these if we want to with debug if. So we could just say, debug if, renderer, use debug camera. And now we could do something like that, and that would be fine. This would be something like I want a debug value here, and I would say that it's debug camera distance. Again, here it is. That's the debug value, right? The problem with this, again, same thing as before. You can't really cache a static here. So, this is one where if we started having too many of these debug values, I'm not sure there'd really be a way to sort of get around this problem. Now, it's worth noting that metaprogramming solves this problem like trivially, right? And a language that wasn't awful would solve this problem trivially as well. But we'll try to stick with doing it the hard way. In something like this, where we have this debug value, the problem is just how do we cache the information, right? And so that's really the thing that's difficult for us to do is not to make this evaluate to the correct thing that we would want it to evaluate to, right? It's pretty easy for us to do something like that or something like this, right? That's not hard. The problem is just how do we make this this debug system thing not cost us a lot of time and energy, because inside an expression we can't create a static variable, right? So inside this plus equals we can't really. Well, we probably could nowadays using like crazy lambda syntax or something that's an absolute nightmare. So I guess if you were targeting C++11, you probably could make something work. But in general, in at least the C++ as of that time, it's not really, I don't know if there's really any way you could really get around that, right? Because what you need to do is figure out a way to get a static variable in here of some kind, and that seems really difficult to do. Now what we could do, again, if we wanted to, is we could actually just have one more place that these were defined, and I don't know if it's worth kind of going through that or not, but that's like kind of that's the trade-off, right? The trade-off is how do we actually manage this stuff exactly? How does it get looked up and so on? And it's pretty easy for our debug ifs to work. If we write them like that, the syntax is pretty clean and there's nothing all that unusual about it. But on the other hand here, if we have debug real32, something like that we want to use inside of an expression, it's much more difficult for us to do. So what we can do if we want to is we can do something like this, where we do one of those debug real32s. And I might even do it something more like that, where it's actually just the type is in there or something like that. We'll see if maybe that's a good idea in a little bit, but we could do something like that. So this way we'd say there's a debug real32, and we just say this is what the name of the thing was going to be, and then we just say what we want to actually declare the variable to be. And that would work as well, right? So that would work fine. It just means we can't do it inside an expression. So then when we come up here, we can write it essentially the same way as this stuff is written. It's basically, and it's actually a little simpler because we don't have to worry about cracking out into multiple macros in that ridiculous way, right? So if here we had a real32, we'd have sort of the name, and then we'd have the variable, right? Not the variable, but a variable. And then all we'd have to do is, again, use this sort of same syntax here, where we do a local persist. This time, we have the ability to sort of graft on, I believe, one of the parameters that actually gets passed in here. Although, yeah, I feel like maybe that is not entirely the case, but we'll try it here. So if we do something like this, right, we can construct what we actually want. And then I guess the only thing that would be a problem there is the real32 value. I mean, what we really want to do, right, is we want to do something like this. I guess this would be an R32 in our current syntax. What we really want to do is say, okay, the variable equals whatever this thing is dot R32, right? And I could even imagine something more like this, where we have a debug variable. We pass what the type is, we pass the name, and then we pass like where it lives in the hierarchy or something like that, right? Something like that. We could even do it more like this, where those things get added on. I kind of like that. I like what that looks like here. I could even imagine it being something like this, so it's a little clearer to read. It's like, here's the type, here's the thing that we want to go, here's the type that it is, or something like that. That looks pretty good to me, but unfortunately, again, thanks to the magic of C++, I think that does put us back squarely into ridiculous pass-through territory. You know, not the end of the world, but that's just the way it goes sometimes, right? It's just the way it goes a lot of the time in C++. Please, John, if you're listening, finish your language sometime soon for those of us who are dying out here using these horrible languages. Okay, so inside here where we have the debug variable, now all I'm going to do is the exact same thing. I create a persistent variable of whatever the type is. And then all I need to do after it gets initialized with the name, the difference now is that there's a type in here that's being passed. Then there's the name, and then there's the variable that I actually want to assign to it. So now when we talk about the name, it's not just the name, it's actually also the variable, because in fact it's not name, I shouldn't say, it's like path. Like it's the path to where that thing exists in the debug hierarchy. So there's the path. And then I've got, you know, this notion that I want to kind of concat these together. So I want the path, then I want a slash, then I want whatever the variable name is. That seems totally reasonable. For how that'll get stored. This all works now correctly. Instead of an if now, it's just the type, whatever the type is that you asked for, right? It's the type, then it's going to be whatever the variable is. And then that's going to be equal to whatever this debug value was, dot whatever the accessor type is, right? And that is something that we probably want to get used to for this stuff to sort of start. This stuff could actually be cleaned up quite a bit if we just unified our naming scheme. And this is something that, again, it's really worth doing. I know it seems like you fuss a lot with these sorts of things, but once you get them right, it's kind of nice to have them right. And so you can see what happened here. Like you can see the way that I was writing this. I just followed our capitalization scheme, which is kind of nice and it makes things look good and all that other stuff. But what you'll notice is these are not programmatically generatable. Unless you write a metaprogram, obviously. These are not programmatically generatable in the C++ preprocessor, but these would be. Right? As soon as I make the statement that the debug type itself is just the word debug type with something at the end of it that is the actual type, and if I took it one step further and take these guys here and actually made these guys be something like value, and then that thing, all of a sudden this becomes a lot more powerful. Because now macros can just pick out the thing that they want all with one go. Right? There's no name translation going on. It's always just whatever the thing is, you know, with its type kind of stuck at the end. And I guess rectangle 2 and 3 don't have that underscore there. That's my imagination running wild, not actually true. What can you do? So there you go. Again, that's just a nice little change there. And so that's all kind of nice stuff. That, again, kind of lines that up really nicely. And now when we look at what actually happens in here, in fact, all of this value set event data stuff, right? Look at all of these things that we wrote. All of those, I think, we could probably do in a more concise way now. I mean, we probably still, I guess you still kind of have to have that cracker in some sense. But we could, in fact, generate all of these guys as macros themselves if we really wanted to. Unfortunately, again, it can't quite go away unless maybe you use the type of macro, but that, yeah, I don't think that'll work. Anyway, point being, that allows us to stop fussing with what we were fussing with before, and we should be able to now have debug variable work exactly as we would want it to. So now, you know, we've got type, path, variable, type, path, variable. I think now what we can do is just say, okay, we don't need a counter. We can just use variable as the thing that gets appended onto there, right? So that's pretty easy. And then here, like I said, when we want to access the value, we can just do value underscore whatever that type is, and those can graph together. You know what I'm saying? Here, the same thing. We sort of have like whatever the variable is that we wanted of that type. That is just going to be, oops, I did it here. Don't know why I didn't do it there. There we go. that all works. And then when we do initialize debug value, we can also pass the type into that. So when we pass the type into initialize debug value, again, now it's easy for us to figure out what the type actually is. It's just whatever the real type was. What if they said they wanted an R32 and that's what they passed us, no problem. We just say, okay, we just append debug type to that thing, and now we have the type identifier that we actually wanted, right? Again, all of this stuff is just nonsense because the C++ people just don't know what they're doing and never really did. And so you kind of constantly are in this situation of fighting everything all the time. These are just things that should have been really simple and never get fixed. But what are you going to do? Hilariously, they added runtime type information, which doesn't actually work. So they kind of tried to solve the problem at some point, or thought maybe they were going to solve the problem, but then didn't solve the problem, which was pretty awesome. But anyway, after we have all that stuff set up, we're in a good position now. In fact, this the way we look at this one doesn't have to do it that way, right? It knows that what it's doing is doing a bool 32 here, right? So that one's totally fine. And this is going to be value v32. So now if we've got that, we can do this like we did here, and it should be fine. We just have to change it so that these things get passed through. Type path variable, type path variable. And that's really about it. Now I've got a bunch of compile errors that I got to clean up because we sort of changed these names a little bit to be, you know, programmatically determinable. So they don't really, well, they already were programmatically determinable, but determinable by the non-programming language that is the C++ macro system. All right, so there we go. That's those, and I expect I have a bunch more to do. So these are all going to be like value R32, value U32, value S32, and value V2, value V3, value V4, value rectangle 2, value rectangle 3, and value bitmap ID, value sound ID, value font ID. Okay. Yeah. Function does not take 3 arguments. That's true. We decided it did. Never actually implemented it, right? So let's go back here and make sure that we actually have that defined to take the arguments that it actually takes. So it's debug event type or debug value type. Debug type? I don't even know what it's, I don't even remember what it's called. It's at the top of this file. It's debug type. Yep. Okay, so now what are you complaining about, Mr. Complaining Thing? What is it that bothers you? You are complaining about, well, actually, that should be that. Okay. Debug event should be preceded by a bracket. Okay. I will take your word for that. Let's see why you are saying that. Why should it have been preceded by a bracket? I don't really follow you. Debug event should be preceded by bracket. Okay. Let's see here. It's only on the debug variable path. And I'm not sure, is there any other, it's just that one, so local persist debug event, it already started complaining that it should have looked like that. Why, pray tell? Right, what, oh, because I forgot, that's great. That's great. So let's see, that's all correct now. Okay, but still the same. Debug event should be preceded by close bracket. Don't get it. Don't know why that would be the case. What am I seeing here? So my variable, is that a quoting problem? Is local persist is defined here or is it not? Is this a figment of my imagination that that's actually there? Nope, that's fine. So that's good. So I'm not sure why it's giving me that particular compile error. Again, the wonders of the macro preprocessor. So let's just see what happens here if that's the debug variable. Let's just see what happens here if I expand this out. So if I've got type, path, and variable, so type, right, is going to be R32 everywhere. So that's just R32. That's debug camera distance. That's debug camera distance. This is renderer. That's really about it. There's not a lot to this thing, right? Debug value, debug camera distance, debug value, debug camera distance. Yeah, that's what it looks like, right? So what's the problem? Debug event should be preceded by a close brace. So it doesn't think I can declare something static here, I guess, or it doesn't know what a debug event is, but it couldn't. That couldn't be true, right? Because here's the debug event. It's right here. So that's fine. So is the problem that the debug if is setting us up for failure? I don't think so, because it looks like that should have been fine. Ah, because I changed the syntax here. I don't know why I did that. In fact, I think I can return it to where it was before. That was just a slip of the fingers. All right, so debug camera value just right. That's all good. Yeah, so now we know that that's probably fine. And now that we have that working, we should be able to do this debug if everywhere. So here's like use room-based camera. I don't actually remember for some of these guys. I don't remember where they were in the hierarchy, right? Use room-based camera was under like renderer camera, I guess. So we can do a debug if here and have that. Yeah, be a thing that looks like this, I guess. Something like that. Here we go, ground chunk checkerboards. Again, same thing now. We just do debug if. And this is just, where was that again? I don't remember where we put it. Use ground chunk checkerboards. This was in, I don't know why it says group chunks. I guess that was just our little accidental thing that we did there. So there's ground chunk checkerboards. We could just do ground chunk checkerboards because we don't probably need to say ground chunks twice. Seems a little redundant. So let's just go ahead and say there's our if. Else we will do the other way around, like so. How are we doing here? So we need v4 color to be defined ahead of time, it looks like. So I'll just go ahead and do that. And there we go. So recompute ground chunks on exe change. Again, should just be a debug if here. We can just call that recompute on exe change. And that's again going to just be ground chunks, right? Yeah. So something like this. Same thing here. Debug if renderer test word draw buffer size. I feel like that's in the renderer, right? Yep. What else we got? Ground chunk outlines, debug if, ground chunks, outlines. Familiar follows hero, debug if. I think this is what, simulation or MDs? Let's call this simulation. Familiar follows hero. Probably simulation is actually stupid. It's probably entities actually better. Could do something like that. maybe. Even, let's call it AI. It's artificially intelligent, guys. Don't you know? It just like follows the guy around, but it's artificially intelligent. I declare that it is the case. So this is going to be probably just like particles test or something like that. And if the particle test is on, kind of does all this stuff. There we go. Can't let that stay. There we go. Okay. Almost done. So this is, oops, this is debug if particles show grid. What else? Use space outlines. Don't know what this would be called exactly. I guess this is entity use space outline or simulation. I don't know who that is. That's just kind of like some guys are outlined, you know, they're being outlined. Who knows why they're being outlined? Nobody knows really. Could be any reason. Why does there have to be a reason? No one knows. All right, so let's see where we're at here. Debug type R32. This is in our interface code, right? When we do debug value, and we set this stuff up, you can kind of see here that we're doing, well, in this case, actually, record debug event, we set, this is just a faux value. Really, this should just be something like debug type unknown, right? It should be like debug type unknown, because it gets set later, right? So at first, it really, like when we do debug value, that should really just set it to whatever, it doesn't know what it is, right? And then it would go, it would move on from there. Okay, so now these are all like really just just quick transform. And all of, I guess probably all of these things too have to be changed, right, to value R32, right? Value B32, value B32, value S32, value U32, and yeah, value V2, value V2, value V3, value V3, value V3. There we go. Gotta remember to do these little guys. And now these are all kind of nice and harmonized, right? Value V4, value V4, value V4. Are these all correct up here as well? Rectangle 2, rectangle 3. That's not correct. That's good. Rectangle 2, rectangle 3, rectangle 2. Kind of busy work here. Nothing particularly interesting. But sometimes you got to do it. Until Mr. Fourth Dimension finishes his code-based editor, we'll just have to make do. Okay, so they're getting close here to being all good, but we still have a little bit more to go. Let's just go ahead and finish that out. So value underscore bitmap ID is what that has to be. Again, same thing here, value underscore bitmap ID. And these are just quickly things we have to change slightly. Value B32, value B32. And again. And I think we're almost done. There we are. So, oops, one more. Frame marker, okay, so frame marker, which is in the Handmade interface stuff, frame marker. Let's see what else we've got here. So frame marker seconds elapsed, real 32. This just needs to be a value R32, and then we're good. Okay. So I think that's everything. Now we have all of that stuff working. All of that stuff has been sort of transmuted, right? So now all of this stuff can just disappear, right? We don't need this file anymore. We can just straight up delete it. The only thing that we need at the moment is this. And so we can just go ahead and cut and paste that into here. And then let's just straight up delete this file, right? Handmade debug variables is going to go away. Goodbye. And now we're again simplifying things even further, you know, trying to get them down to an even more straightforward version, and just kind of compact that code. Now that we sort of see what we want, we tested things, we kind of know what things we want, what things we don't want. So we're getting closer. Okay. So initialize debug value is really the only function that we introduced at all in all of that, right? So now that we have, we sort of spec that complete system, the only function that we actually need to implement is this thing here, right? Now, what we do need to do in this other case over here, we need to sort of think about this one more level. Again, before I go off implementing this, we kind of need to think about one more thing, which is that how could we get it, or could we get it, to compile out, right? Is there a way we could get this thing to compile out entirely? And so the way that I'm sort of thinking about that is like, okay, if I wanted to make it, so in fact I could even do this right now. If I want to make this so it compiles out and all of the values that we had before would just be, any of the debug ifs or whatever, any of the debug variables, those would be set to permanent values. How would we do that, right? So if we take a look at the debug if, the big problem with the debug if is, and actually all of these, is that we don't necessarily always have any way of really defining exactly what the thing is that we're talking about other than the string that was given to it. So that makes it hard to actually compile that thing out. And so that's why I'm thinking, like I kind of, before I go and actually finish implementing this, I might want to tweak it a little, right? Because what I'd like to do is be able to do something like, okay, if we have debug if here, and in fact, I guess, one thing I could say is also, I might want this to actually always happen this way. Right. So we're just talking about redefining these things. So in one case, I have the one that we're actually going to use is something like this. In the other case, the one that we're going to use is going to look like something else. And what I'd like to be able to do here is, instead of doing local persist and all of this stuff here, where we actually define it or do any of that stuff, what I'd rather do is have some way of going, okay, what I really want to do is like debug constant, or something like just it's a constant, right? And then we have like a name. Right? So that we can just define, we can pound define that thing and it would just be whatever it actually was going to be, right? So we would still have handmade config.h. It would just only ever get used if the debug system was turned off, right? So it would basically be something that looked like, oh, if we are, if we are not handmade internal, then we use this information that we have here. Otherwise, we don't. If that makes sense. So in here, it could do the if on the constant name, and then when we ask for like a debug variable, like in this case, what we would actually get is this. Or I guess I should say this. And what you can see if you look at this is we're going to have a problem with that name, with the naming scheme eventually. The reason we're going to have a problem with the naming scheme eventually, if I literally just sort of did it this way, even if we made the ifs work somehow, is that if you look at what the variable names actually are going to be, they're going to be stuff, well, I mean, you can already see what they are, right? Let's go ahead and take a look here. So the names of these debug values, okay, that's not going to work. I wanted it to just jump me to some of them, but I'll go ahead and grab debug variable. So if you take a look at what happens here, you're going to have something like renderer slash, and it would probably be like camera distance or something like that, right? Or, it's debug camera distance, or who knows what it is, or outlines, use outlines, who knows, right? Whatever it is, this may occur in multiple places in our hierarchy, potentially, right? So, if we did something like this, who knows if someone else might want something called use debug camera, right? Or something like that. Or maybe we even have it like that, and it's like use debug. Well, now this name use debug, once we have to make it so that there's a bunch of constants defined for that thing, it's no longer going to be unique without these parts of it, right? So I can't just expect somebody to somewhere define something like renderer, use debug 0, because it may be that there's someone else in some other part of the code who's done something like this, right? And that's not going to fly, right? So what I need to be able to do is I need to be able to include the path information, which means that things are a little more complicated, right? But what I can do is I can revert a little bit back to sort of the thing that I was saying before, where I could sort of go back to doing something like this. That I could probably make work, and here is how I would make that work, right? How I would make that work is when we are talking about these things like so, we could just stringize this in debug mode and make it be an actual struct layout in non-debug mode, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at what that would look like if we were to do it that way, right? So in fact, and I guess, do we actually, yeah, we still need to do it this way. So all we would need to do for that is, again, the debug ifs kind of have to look the same way. Unfortunately, it's a little bit annoying to actually do it that way, but again, it's not the end of the world necessarily. But anyway, that's what it would have to look like. So debug ifs are going to have a path and a variable as well, which kind of tell us what it is that's the actual thing that's getting used there. But that at least unifies these guys a little bit, so that's kind of nice as well, I suppose, at the end of the day. And so then what would happen here is we just do something like this, constant.path.variable, something like that will be fine, right? Or, debug, or constants, global constants, something like that. Who knows? Something like this. And again, the same would actually be true here. Exactly the same thing would happen here, like that. And then whenever we were trying to access these guys, up here, the way we were doing it before, instead of that slash, we would just add another dot onto there, and that would be how we would pass that information forwards, right? So here we've got path and variable again. Now we don't need counter anymore. We can just use it variable like we were doing, I suppose. And then we can, there we go. Then we can do the same sort of thing here where we do the concatenation. When we pass this stuff down, we're going to pass exactly the same stuff. So it's really exactly the same code. The only difference is one's hard-coded to do that if statement because there's really not a lot of other ways to do it. We could actually also have it so it did that for us more directly. I don't know if we want to do that or not, right? But you could imagine doing that. I think it's probably good to just let it do the extra typing in this macro and let it go. So anyway, that's what I'm talking about. And so if I make that work, then you can kind of see how we could start to construct making these constants, right? It could just be some giant construct nightmare scenario thing that we create that allows us to sort of create these variables. And we could even imagine if the path itself perhaps were done with something else like underscores maybe, or something else that was like a character that was, we wouldn't even need to create structs. We could create them in some other way. I'm trying to think if there's some, if that's too much of a limitation. But basically what I'm saying is, like, imagine you did something like this, and we just said that that's how the paths were defined in our system. You can imagine everything sort of working through that system as well. Again, I just don't really know what the best way to do that is exactly. I'm going to go with the underscores for now because I think it'll make the simplest thing, because then these can all be pound defined and don't really have to worry about it, which is kind of nice. So I think what I'm going to do is let the paste operator work overtime on this particular situation and let it do something like that, which is kind of ridiculous, but you can kind of see where I'm going with that. Now they'll all be variables that have a unique name no matter what the situation is. And that seems like potentially a better idea to me. And so then what we would do, and I guess this also means that to some degree this would just work as well. Now we don't really need a path, I guess, for those guys. We could just do something like that. It's just called renderer show light samples, and those underscores would get translated into nests in the hierarchy. I'm actually probably okay with that. I feel like that's probably fine for the most part with the way these are getting translated. I don't know. It feels like it'll probably be okay to me, so I'm just going to say let's go with that. And I'm running out of time here. I think I'm a little bit over already, so I'm just going to kind of wrap this up quickly. So I think I feel reasonably okay with that. And like I said, this one can actually be done without that. We could just use just path by itself and not actually have to bother with anything else. You just stringize that directly and again, let that kind of be its own thing. And here, that same deal, right? You can just eliminate a little bit of the complexity in the if case. Not a whole lot, but a little bit, right? Again, so in this case, we've got the debug if just has a path. There's the path. The path is something now that you can use directly, so it just has to sort of crack that out as it goes. We may not need the second one here because now we're not translating a variable that actually exists. So we may actually be able to get away with only one level, but I'm not going to deal with that right now because we're basically out of time. Okay, so let's see here. Debug if. Where is our debug if? We can now say the name does not need to be in there anymore. Let's see here. Undeclared identifier, that is true, and that's fine. That's what we want. But let's just go ahead and fix these up. So that's renderer camera use debug. This is renderer camera distance, right? Or debug distance, something like that, probably. That's all fine. We then have debug camera distance. It's just going to be debug distance there. Okay, so this is if renderer camera. We didn't really name this. It should have been room-based camera, right? Something like that. I think that's what that was supposed to be. So we'll leave that there. Global constants, we've got ground chunks, checkerboards. So that's pretty straightforward as well. What else we got here? I think that's the Price is Right theme song. I don't really remember. It's something like that. I'm just going to go ahead and say it's something like that. So we're almost there. There we go. Let's see here. Probably could do this faster by using grep. There we go. And again, like I said, all of this is just because you're so limited when you program in C++ due to the fact that they just don't know anything about metaprogramming, so they miss all of the opportunities to save a lot of time and energy because the people who design the language just don't think that way. And so they just don't know, right? It's just like a fundamental, we don't really know how to do this kind of programming, so we never think to enable it or something like that. C'est la vie. Anyway, so if in here I go in and actually define these now, we're sort of, we'll at least get back to sort of parity with where we were. And then tomorrow we can make those all actually generate stuff in the debug thing, and it'll all be good, right? So this is what we would generate, right? When we go to write our config file, we just write these out, and they wouldn't actually be used except in the case where we actually compile the whole debug system out, and that way we know that it will completely clean out the code, and there will be no actual cost to us for turning the debug system off, because they'll all be essentially they'll just be constants that the compiler can literally trivially optimize out. It doesn't need to do any thinking at all. It can literally just go, oh, that's a constant 0. No need to do anything with it whatsoever, right? Okay, so let's see here. I'm almost done with these guys, and then we can do some Q&A. Let's go ahead and just want to finish this up so we all compile properly. Let's see here. Particles test. And particles show grid, and use space outlines. There we go. Right? So that should all be good. Debug distance, undeclared identifier. Camera debug distance. What? Renderer camera. Yep, that's a typo. And so then we're all back to rendering. We're back to working everything properly. And so that sets us up tomorrow. That whole system has sort of been excised and sets us up to just put it through the standard debug event path, right? So tomorrow we'll be able to kind of unify those two systems, which collapses yet another level of complexity down, which is great. So again, I'm really happy with the way this is turning out. I think we're getting there. But it's time to stop. So I will go ahead and go to the Q&A. If you have any questions about what we did today, please feel free to go ahead and I'm just looking here. That's pretty great. I didn't know that you could get the HMH bot to like say something flame baity. That's pretty great. That is pretty awesome. Let's see. PSI 9 says, why use get key state instead of WM key down, WM key up? So the answer is because they are modifier keys. So WM key up, WM key down is for letting, is if you're trying, if it's a fundamental thing that you're trying to do, is detect when keys go up and down. Then WM key up and key down are nice because they let you just get directly to the keys as they change, right? They're like, oh, okay, I got a notification that this key changed, and so that was good, and it's all good, right? But in this case, we don't actually care about that, right? In this case, we don't care at all about knowing when the shift key went up or down, knowing when the control key went up or down, or knowing when the alt key went up or down. All we actually care about is every frame when we send the mouse info down, we just want to know whether the control, alt, or shift keys were up or down at that instant in time. And that's exactly what get key state is designed to do. It's just designed to tell us that, right? Now there's two kinds. One is called get key state, one's called get async key state. And if you look at the way they are defined, get async key state tells you the state as Windows knows it at the time of the call, whereas get key state, not get async key state, tells you what your program thinks it was if all you had been doing was looking at the key up, key down messages. So actually, there's really no difference between you tracking key up, key down yourself for shift, control, and alt. Since you're not doing anything when they're pushed, they're not a trigger key. There's no difference between that and you just like manually tracking the bool yourself and just calling get key state. So for our purposes, get key state is basically perfect. It does exactly what we want it to do, right? So there you go. Elvin, I don't have much experience in it, but you mentioned the RTTI in C++ is not as good. Could you explain a bit why? Yeah, so there's a lot of reasons the RTTI in C++ is not as good. One reason is there's no way to like macro between the RTTI and the actual type itself. So it, you can't like you couldn't, I'll put it this way. It all stems from the concept that the RTTI is opaque data that you have no way of actually using or accessing. So for example, if you wanted to write two programs, one on Clang and like one on MSVC, and you wanted them to like save out the runtime type information in a way that the other one could read. I don't know if they ever fixed this, probably not, but at least RTTI as it was defined was completely compiler specific. So you have actually no way of really getting a actual value you can use to identify this type in a way that your program can understand. It's strictly like specific to that particular compilation on that particular compiler of that particular program. Furthermore, even separate compiles of the same program are not guaranteed to produce the same RTTI, right? So like it could just be, like one way it could implement RTTI is just a pointer to your vtable. Could be the thing that says what this type is, right? And so that's just not usable as a basic system for doing metaprogramming on types, because you want to, one of the first things you're going to want to do with your types is like be able to save them to disk, right? And restore them or something across runs of your program. And that's just not possible with the way they spec the RTTI. Now, whether they fix that in like C++ 2032 or whatever, I'm not sure. but at least up until like, you know, the turn of the millennium, right, or even the turn of this decade, it was not the case. It just didn't work. Culverfly, I don't quite get why you need to nest the macros for debug. Can you explain it? Yeah, it's just because the paste operator pastes the actual macro parameter directly. So let me see if I can and maybe make this a little more clear. What would be the easiest way to do this? Let's see. So let's suppose we were to grab something in the thing with the stuff. All right, so here's a way I could show you pretty cleanly what it is. Let's suppose we're in handmade.cpp, and we go through here and we create some macros. So I'm going to do like a macro called onetime, and here is the parameter, right? And I'm going to say that it is going to be equal to whatever the param is, right? So now I say, okay, I've got a char star onetime result equals onetime foo, right? I'm then going to make a thing called twotime, right? That basically does what we're sort of saying, but with a call through, right? So it does a call through there, and then I'm going to make one called threetime. Arg! I finally on my Emacs config at work turned off insert as a key, and it was pretty great. I will tell you that. So anyway, okay, so threetime, there we go, right? And so let's see what these actually do. Each of them produces a string, right? That's the stringizing operator. So it takes whatever the parameter is that you pass. In each case, we pass the same thing, which is foo. The first one turns it into a string. The second one calls a macro, which turns it into a string. The third one calls a macro, which calls a macro, which turns into a string. And so let's just see what those three things actually turn out to be equal to when we run this, right? So I'm going to set a breakpoint in game update and render there. Game update and render. Here we come through. When we step through this, right, we get one-time result. Oops, one-time result. Two-time result. Three-time result, right? Okay. So as you can see in here, right, no matter which one we did, they each give us the exact same parameter, right? It's all totally fine, right? So no harm, no foul. Everyone's happy. If we need to do something where we just take in a parameter and stringize it, it doesn't matter, right? But now what happens if what we wanted to do, for example, was stringize, say, the file, like whatever we wanted to turn, like, say, or the line number into a string, right? So instead of doing pound param here, right, what we actually want to do is this, right? So I want to turn that into it. Now, if you see what happens when I compile here, oh, well, there's okay. So that's the first thing I guess I should mention, and I forget about this all the time. So the first thing is you can't actually do that, right? This pound operator here, it's just a flat out error if you use something that's actually a macro thing in and of itself, right? So one reason to do just the two-time version is if I needed to pass in the file, right? So if I needed to pass in the file, you can see that would be actually required of me, right? That's something that I'd actually have to do directly. But now that I've got those two, you can see that in this case, what was I going to say? Oh, I guess this is even earlier than I thought it was going to be. I didn't think we were going to quite need it yet. But actually, you can already see it happening. Okay. So if you look at what happened here, right, this was actually surprised me. I never remember exactly. Again, that's why I say it's always kind of an epic nightmare, the C++ preprocessor stuff. But So what happened here, right, is the thing that I was trying to avoid by calling twice in the other ones. Because we passed this in as a parameter, the first attempt in the 2-time version to stringize it, it takes the actual thing you passed in and stringizes that, right? So it's basically replacing param with file, the word, and stringizing that. So instead of getting a string version of the file, right? And I guess saying the file's already a string. So what I should have done here is I should have done this to make it clearer, right? I'm looking for a string that is the line number. That's what I actually want, right? And so as you can see, like the first time through, when you only call through one parameter, you actually just, all you get is the line directive turned into a string. Whereas if you call through twice, the first time it replaces param with line, the second time it replaces line with the number and then stringizes it, right? So you get that sort of cascading down. And so for every layer of peeling that you need to do for a parameter, you have to do that. I don't ever remember exactly how it works. I should probably just go read exactly the C++ preprocessor spec, because it's probably like, oh, every expansion, it rewrites each token one time, and so blah, 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 right? There's probably a really easy way to remember it if you actually go and learn. I never bothered to do so. But that's the problem that you face, right? And so sometimes you have to call it twice, sometimes you don't. Like I said, I don't know that we actually need all three that we had in there. That's why I was saying when I typed it, you could probably get away with 2 for all the stuff we just did, because we never had to pass anything like the file directive or anything into there. You mind going over your Debug UI plan for those who don't know what the current plan is? I just want food. I don't have a plan. I'm just making a debug system and seeing what the stuff is that I actually want to know, if that makes sense. So like, I know I want to be able to display debug data. I know I want to be able to display profiling data. We now have both of those. And so I'm just trying to unify them as cleanly as possible, and then make it so that on top of that, the interface is good enough that it's like fast and fluid to get at the data we need. So we're pretty close. It's just the UI now at this point is not as good as it needs to be. So we just need to go refine that debug system to the point where it's nice and fluid to kind of get around it, and then I think we're good. But I don't have a plan for that. I'm just writing the code as I kind of figure it out as I go. Golden WH, isn't metaprogramming a security hole? I don't even know what that means. Elvin, I've been reading about the cost of virtual functions. Normal non-virtual functions cost a call command, but with virtual we need 2 fetches and a call. Is that very costly in performance critical areas? Is that the reason to avoid virtuals? For me, I don't like the fact they introduce hidden costs. Makes it harder to reason about your code. The reason I don't use virtuals is because I find switch statements to be more usable. So it doesn't have that much to do with the cost of a virtual call. But yes, it is true that virtual calls are much harder to optimize. If you're in the position where you're using a switch statement to determine things, and you find that your code is going too slowly, it's usually not that hard to make that into some kind of a more smart dispatch. And oftentimes the switch isn't expensive because it doesn't have to fetch anything, right? It's just the one fetch. It doesn't have to go fetch and fetch. It just does one fetch, and then the jump can be just sort of like the compiler can often optimize the jump and so on. So switch statements are usually a little bit easier. So it's true that, probably you get some wins with them, but that's not actually why I do them, because, I just don't tend to like virtual functions I don't like spreading out the code for a single idea across many files like that. I just don't find it to be that useful. So I don't like virtual functions as an architectural thing. It has nothing to do with the speed. But it is true that the speed can be a problem. I have never actually had that specific experience myself. I've had people say that like virtual functions were really problematic on consoles for them, especially like older consoles like Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3. I've heard nightmares about that. I don't have the personal experience to know how true they were or how relevant that was, or if it was for other reasons. And I don't know. So I don't pretend to to say that I have had like lots of experiences optimizing code that had virtual functions in it and it caused me a lot of problems. That's not true. I don't tend to write code that way. I've not had that experience. I don't know. So I think that's probably something that's better for someone else to answer. Probably someone who's done a big C++ project on a console. How much of a problem that is these days would be an interesting question for them. And I would be interested to hear the answer. I just don't use them, so I don't care. But it's definitely different than if statements. You know, it has a different performance profile potentially. Elvin, I can't figure out for the life of me a way to draw an empty non-filled rectangle via the Win32 API. An empty non-filled rectangle. Oh, you mean like you want to stroke the outline of a rectangle? It's real easy if you do want to do that. Filling a rectangle in Win32, you just don't draw a rectangle. You use move to and line to. So like for example, when we do our stretch blit here, right? If you wanted to, you could pretty easily do move to, line to, and if you look at how this works, let's see, move to EX. You can kind of see how this goes. So you can see this here. You basically pass whatever the DC is that you're trying to draw to, which in our case is this one. You pass the two coordinates, so like 10, 10, or something like that. You can then just do lines to each of the things that you wanted to do, right? So typical rectangle going to look something like that, right? Oops, don't need those there. And so that's how you would typically draw a rectangle. You can see it right there. There it is. And that's gonna, I believe, draw it in the current foreground color. So if you need to change the color of the thing, it's pretty straightforward to do. That's just gonna be probably something you can look in here that would tell you all about. It's gonna probably stroke it with the current pen, right? And you can probably set the current pen cheaply. They added some trivial functions for that. It's like set solid pen or something like this. I don't quite remember. Set solid pen Win32. Yeah, where is it? It's not. It's like get solid pen Win32. It's been so long since I've done any of this stuff. I don't really remember, but you could do all these things. Solid pen color, that's what it is. Solid pen color. This thing, right? So you can call like set DC pen color, and that allows you to kind of like mess with it. So I could say like set DC pen color, device concept RGB. Here's that lovely yellow I'm so fond of. And I believe, don't totally remember, but I believe we then have to select the stock object of the default pen. You see it's still black, right? But you can just do a select object at the beginning before you do anything else. You can do this nonsense to tell the DC that the pen that you're always going to use is going to be that one that I just looked up here. So DC pen, that guy right there. So you just want to do like that, right? And I think that's it, right? And so there's that yellow rectangle, and you can change that as frequently as you want to, and do any of the other stuff in there. So once you have that set up that way, you can even do you can just change it per line. GDI was actually fine, for its day. It was a totally fine. Is it great? No, but it's totally usable. It's not the world's worst graphics API. So if you I don't know why you would be using it, because it doesn't seem like these days, if you could use OpenGL, you would, but there you go. You can, change the pen per line or, whatever you want to do. That's fine. So that's, if that's what you're trying to do, that's real easy. That's the easiest way to do it. DeFreaky, what are your thoughts on Twitch starting to affect game design? I'm not really a game designer, so I don't, I'm a programmer, and so I mean, I like the fact that I can stream development as a way of teaching, uh, and I like that aspect of Twitch. I don't know much about how Twitch affects game design. I mean, I understand the concept that if people are now saying that like Twitch is a big, or any video streaming service really, is a big way in which games get press, I can understand that people might start designing their games to look good on Twitch or play well on Twitch to an audience or whatever. Do I think it's a bad thing? Not really, because anyone who's going to do that probably wasn't super filled with like artistic integrity for their game anyway. Like that's probably talking about people like Call of Duty who are just like, we're designing games to be like mass market and super PRable and super marketable, right? And they were already compromising all sorts of things that might have been, interesting about their games in order to sell more copies. The fact that they're gonna maybe compromise those to play better on Twitch is not. It's just 6 of one, half dozen of the other, right? They were already marketing-driven games to begin with. So people who are really passionate about a particular game idea and really want to make that game idea, I don't think those people are going to be super affected by Twitch in a negative way. They'll just make their game, and if it plays well on Twitch, it does, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. Now, there's a long-term effect that could be deleterious, which is that if it turns out that your game has to play well on Twitch in order to get an audience, then you end up with those people who do have an artistic idea and make games that maybe don't play well on Twitch. If they can't survive, if they can't make a living because now their game will never sell, those people go away. Now you have lost something, and that's like a systemic effect, like a long-term effect. That's a natural selection effect. That could be bad. But we don't know that that's happening yet, right? And we don't know if that will happen. So it's premature to suggest that that's a problem. So I would say the first order effect doesn't concern me much. It's just people who are already pandering, maybe doing more pandering or something. So the only problem would be if it started to cause like a natural selection effect where games that couldn't play well on Twitch disappear. That would be sad. But I don't know that that's going to happen. So far, I would say, if anything, Twitch has been having a positive effect for obscure games sometimes, because more people are watching games, which means that more people are seeing games streamed, which means that there's more possibilities for them to find out about games that they weren't finding out about. So far, I would say I don't think Twitch is affecting systemically game design in a bad way. It may actually be having a positive effect, but again, a lot of that's too early to tell. Since I'm not a game designer, don't have a strong opinion about it. That's just my knee-jerk reaction. Boondoggle42, could you list the important features a good graphical debugger should have? I mean, what you see me using on Handmade Hero is the bare minimum. Like, your thing should be able to do everything that I'm doing in Visual Studio. It should have the memory display window. It should have a quick updating watch window, which Visual Studio doesn't have, unfortunately. It should be faster than Visual Studio, hopefully. But it should have a watch window that's really easy to use, saves my state from run to run, right? So I shouldn't have to re-add my variables or whatever. It should be trivial to close and restart the program quickly. It should never crash. It should never like hang up the graphics system or anything like that. Linux fails on both of those counts. It should always be able to inspect all my debug variables. That's a big problem with a lot of graphical front ends on Linux, is they can't inspect unions and stuff like this. Even though GDB can, it's weird. They have these weird like bugs. Local variables cause problems. So yeah, just a reasonable implementation of what Visual Studio does is the bare minimum. And that right now we don't really have anywhere other than Visual Studio, which is kind of sad. Casto5, are you one of those that thinks that previously DirectX was better than OpenGL, but now is the opposite? I don't think I've ever thought that DirectX was better than OpenGL. Kimosabi76, do you know how far has metaprogramming come along in other fields? I can imagine research using genetic algorithms to self-enhance code. I do not know anything about that, no. All right. Okay, let's go ahead and spin things down. Okay. So Thank you, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you, as always. If you would like to follow along at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, and it comes with the source code, so if you want to play around with it, follow along at home, that is the place to do that. So, yeah, we also have a forum site. You can go to ask questions, and there's an annotated episode guide up there. We also have a Patreon page you can pledge to if you want to support the video series. We have a tweetbot you can go to if you want to check the schedule. And we have a conference now. So if you want to go to handmadecon.org, you can read about that. It's got a pretty awesome speaker list as well. It's pretty much my dream list of speakers. It's basically 5 people who I really want to talk about programming, who do exactly the kind of programming that we talk about on Handmade Hero here. And so definitely check that out if you want to. It's more information's on the mollyrocket.com webpage there. So yeah, check that out. We still have some tickets left. They are selling off pretty fast, so I don't know how much longer there will be tickets left. But check it out. They're not very expensive, and we'd love to see you there. That's about it for today. I will see you guys back here tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Until then, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you guys on the internet. Take it easy, everyone.